Thank you for having me here today. So indeed, I want to talk about the challenges of bringing AI innovation to market, in particular for startups. And rather than talk about, I've kind of oversold with this title of the talk, bringing cutting-edge AI products and services to market. That's worth way more than 12 minutes of chat. So I'm going to focus on two things, really. First is a piece of research I did as a consultant to the Catapult over the last summer. And then some stuff that we're doing now. So I should say I'm an interloper. I'm not actually the head of machine learning and AI at the Catapult. I'm a maternity cover. The real head is Anat El Halal. So I'm going to introduce the digital Catapult for those of you who don't know what catapults are or what digital Catapult is. I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges particular to AI machine learning startups that are different to challenges faced by general startups. I'm going to look at the insights and results that we got from the Machines for Machine Intelligence research report that I just mentioned, and then go on and talk about some of the things that we've done in response to that and some of the things that we want to do in the future. Oh, it's still there. So catapults are a network of centres of technology excellence set up in the UK to enable the UK to be competitive in the worldwide market. They're independent, they're not for profit. The digital Catapult focuses on digital technologies, but amongst the digital technologies, 3 of them. So AI machine learning, which I want to talk about today, future networks, so that's 5G, low power networks, wide area networks, and immersive, so VR, AR, mixed reality and haptics, and often the intersection between all of those things. Those technology spaces have some challenges in common. The first is that often there is a lack of access to facilities to do for sandboxing, to do experiments, to understand what works and what doesn't. It's a fragmented landscape, so they're quite nascent. And it's easy to forget this when you see, particularly in the AI space, such a lot in the news from the AI-first companies like Google and co, that actually this isn't deployed much yet in the real world, in the wild. And of course, there's a knowledge gap, which is as a result of that. So I'm going to focus on lack of access to facilities and the knowledge gap in particular, and do it through the lens of machine intelligence startups rather than corporates. So these startups, they face challenges that, in addition to the normal challenges that startups face, such as needing to raise funding and find product market fit. Those of you working in this space will be aware that there is competition for talent, so accessing talent, keeping it is tricky. Similarly, it's a trope now, and I think many of the people that have spoken on this stage before me have talked about the requirements for lots of good training data. There's what I mentioned before about industry adoption. So there was a report by McKinsey Global Institute, which is now a year old, but it talked about how actually only 9% of companies that they surveyed are deploying AI at scale. Well, few companies are deploying AI at scale, and only 9% of them are even looking at machine learning, never mind deep learning. But the final thing is, actually, it's really difficult to bring these innovations to market because of the sheer complexity of the infrastructure, the data, the hardware that you need to put in place to scale efficiently, to deploy with an acceptable latency, say. And we call these things, this collection of things, the tooling, the processes, AI plumbing. And as those of you in London will know if you've ever called out a London plumber, this can be complex, risky, and expensive. So we decided to look at compute. We've heard a lot about compute here today already, but how does it affect the ability of startups in the UK to innovate and to create ambitious business plans? So we decided to do a research report, which involves some desk research and also a survey of startups. And this is what I will talk about next. So I think I'm about the 4th person to put this gorgeous picture up from OpenAI showing that deep learning is computationally expensive. So I won't dwell on that, but I want to make the point that it's not just computationally expensive, it's expensive. And this can be a bit counterintuitive because we live in extraordinary times where access to scalable compute is as never before. But the point is that the computational complexity of these models is increasing faster than the compute available. And so, for instance, one of the pieces of research up there from Baidu, I saw them speak at a conference, and he said if we'd had to do this on a commercial cloud service, it would have cost us $2 million. So that's clearly something to bear in mind if you're a startup. The second thing is the need for technical expertise is rising. So it's not just doing the deep learning or doing your machine learning. Actually, there's a whole lot of systems engineering and code optimization challenges if you want to deploy this in the real world. And I've started to see papers, so you might see something appear on Archive 1 year which says, we have a capability to do this. And then a year later, another paper that says, but to deploy it in the real world, here's another paper talking about those challenges. And I'm thinking here about papers like Google's WaveNet for speech synthesis, or Baidu's deep speech, or Google's neural machine translation. Actually, the headline results were absolutely extraordinary, but getting them into the hands of consumers involved such a lot more. And I've just popped a little tweet down there about academics starting to feel this constraint about where they can actively play. Does the same thing, is it the same for startups? So the third thing, again, I'm not going to spend very much time on this because if you were here for James Wang's talk earlier, you'll have seen that Computational Resources is expanding. This is interesting because innovating in hardware is unbelievably expensive. It only happens if there's a huge market. So it's nice to see that there's been inflection points and new entrants are coming in. But it does mean that startups, or anyone really, faces a challenge of how to choose what is the appropriate hardware for them. And if you're not an expert in that kind of physical layer stuff, that can be non-trivial. And the fourth thing, machine intelligence techniques are evolving. This is obvious. We're currently in a big, deep learning-focused world, but there are lots of other things happening. And it's true to say that as we get new computational capabilities, that will enable us to do more in some of these other ways. And research avenues will have different computational requirements. So we kind of live in this quite complicated world where things are very new. And I really like this quote from Phil Blunson, which I stole from a MOOC, actually. But it's what he's saying there about you have to be like a software developer 40 years ago. You have to understand the hardware. It's quite true. And actually, most of us are quite narrowly focused in our expertise. We don't have all of these things at our fingertips. And if you're a startup, of course, you don't have vast teams of people to do the infrastructure, systems engineering and optimization for you. So that's all very well, some nice desk research, but we thought we'd ask the UK startups whether this is a problem. Oh dear. I can tell you that the scrambled percentage there is 60%. So we surveyed UK startups. I think we had about 68 responses, another 12 or so in-depth interviews, and 60% of those startups said that they did feel compute constrained. It was correlated naturally with level of, with stage of funding. So naturally, the earlier stage startups felt it somewhat more than later ones, but across the stages. And if you look at the research report, we've gone into a lot more depth as well in terms of whether that's different if you're doing deep learning or if you're doing something a bit more symbolic, or whether it depends on what data you're using. The 60% seems to be the kind of standard percentage in the report. So we thought, what can we do about it? And we've launched something called Machine Intelligence Garage. I'm just looking at the audience. I wonder if anyone from the team is here. If you are, give us a wave. There's Michaela. Hi, Max. So this is an initiative to give startups access to computation power through our collaborators and partners, which is on a rolling basis. So if you feel compute constrained, there's always a time where it's appropriate to apply. It's a very simple application process. We have hosted hardware at Digital Catapult. We're partnered with AWS and with Google Cloud Platform to provide computing vouchers, and with some of the UK HPC infrastructure. But importantly as well, we are hosting more experimental stuff. So there's a space to experiment and look at new chips that are coming through. And we're doing some benchmarking work as well. So we will feed into some of the new initiatives on benchmarking and profiling to kind of try and help inform the decisions that startups have to make with relatively little resource. And having been going now for, we've onboarded 19 startups. We've been going since January. We're seeing other themes coming through. The first of these is, of course, that it's not just about the physical layer, the hardware. It's about so much more. And getting all of the things you need in this technology stack is hard. So startups are commonly writing their own routines and programs for common problems. So perhaps it's something to do with the experimentation pipeline, or it's about getting up and running on the infrastructure. And that is an overhead that probably you could do without if it's a common problem. Perhaps there are new products and services out there for you. The other thing is that uniformly, the startups we talk to, they would like to build businesses which share their personal values. They would like to adhere to all of the relevant regulation. They would like to make sure that the products and services they build are doing what they intend them to do and not things that they don't intend. And I think this is, again, back to AI plumbing. It's all the processes, products, tools you need to bring AI products and services to market. And I've just put a little quote there from Facebook, because Facebook is, of course, an AI-first company. But it has had to build quite a lot of proprietary, big infrastructure to serve its AI-powered products and services. And it's also been much in the news from the point of view of ethics. So it's kind of on our minds. And we thought, first of all, we need to understand this space. What are the different tools, processes, services out there? And so we've got a little bit of a work in progress here, which is an attempt to map AI plumbing. And we are going to be putting a blog up in the next few weeks where we invite people to contribute and give us some feedback on whether this makes sense or what it means, whether included or not included when you'd like to be. Broadly speaking, it's on two vertices. So if you look on the x-axis, this is about going from idea through to reality. So we start off at the planning stage, and I think this, again, something that's often missed. When is the right time to use AI in your business? Is it the most appropriate thing to use? How do you manage your resources? How do you choose your resources? And there's some really good initiatives that I've popped there, which are around benchmarking and information. And then, of course, there's your data technologies. How do you source data? How do you clean it? How do you store it? Onto model training and evaluation and inference and deployment, which are the kind of things that we associate with machine learning. But the vertical axis goes from the kind of physical at the bottom through to the abstract. And I've said before, we focused on hardware, but we think that all of these things are important, and certainly the one at the top, responsible AI. The feedback that we get is that companies would like to do this. They know the why, but they don't know the how. And this fits in quite nicely with our process for selecting companies for the garage. We would like to have an ethical component to our selection process, and we are in the process of putting that together and publishing it so that can be a resource, along with some other tools that make doing AI in practice practicable. So I think I am summarising. Yes. What we're seeing is that we're now in a phase where machine intelligence is moving from demonstrating capability to actually being out there in the wild. But we're only at the foothills of that happening, really, for most startups and most companies. There are some challenges associated with that. So our research showed that compute is a constraint for startups. So our systems availability and expertise, but also the ethics. And so we would like to help the UK startups be competitive and be as ambitious as they can. And that's it from me. Thank you very much.